Hey everyone, welcome back to our AP World History Review series. Today, we're tackling Unit 8, Topic 8, the end of the Cold War. This is a huge turning point in modern history, so let's break down exactly how this decades-long standoff finally came to a close. Grab your notebooks and let's get started. So, how did the Cold War, this epic struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union, actually end? It wasn't one single event, but more like a series of dominoes falling. We can boil it down to a few key factors. New political leadership in the Soviet Union, technological and military pressures from the US, and major economic weaknesses within the Soviet system itself. Let's start with the US side of the equation. In the early 1980s, President Ronald Reagan took a much more aggressive stance against the Soviet Union. He didn't just want to contain communism, he wanted to defeat it. He famously called the USSR an evil empire. This wasn't just tough talk. Reagan's administration launched a massive military buildup. A key part of this was the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, which the media nicknamed Star Wars. The idea was to create a space-based missile defense system that could shoot down Soviet nuclear missiles before they even reached the United States. Now, whether this was technologically feasible at the time is a huge debate, but that wasn't the point. The point was to challenge the Soviets to a new arms race. An incredibly expensive high-tech arms race that Reagan and his advisors believed the Soviet economy simply couldn't afford. This put immense pressure on the Soviet leadership. They had to either keep up or fall behind, and keeping up was becoming impossibly expensive. Now, let's pivot to the Soviet Union. By the 1980s, their economy was in serious trouble. The centrally planned communist system was incredibly inefficient. There were constant shortages of basic consumer goods like bread and shoes. People would wait in long lines for hours, often for nothing. The system just couldn't deliver the quality of life that people in the West enjoyed, and everyone knew it. On top of that, the Soviet Union was bogged down in its own costly war in Afghanistan, which started in 1979. This became their version of the Vietnam War, a long, brutal, and expensive conflict that drained resources and morale. It was a massive financial burden and a public relations disaster, showing the limits of Soviet military power. This is where a new leader comes in, and he's a game changer. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev was different. He was younger, more energetic, and he recognized that the Soviet system was failing and needed drastic reform to survive. He wasn't trying to end communism, but to save it by fixing its deep-seated problems. To do this, he introduced two revolutionary policies. The first was called glasnost, which means openness. For the first time in decades, the government allowed for more freedom of speech and public discussion. People could openly criticize the government and talk about the country's problems without fear of being sent to a gulag. This was a radical shift from the oppressive secrecy of previous Soviet regimes. The second policy was perestroika, which means restructuring. This was Gorbachev's plan for economic reform. He wanted to move away from the rigid central planning and introduce some elements of free market capitalism. He allowed for small private businesses and gave state-owned factories more autonomy. The goal was to revitalize the stagnant Soviet economy and make it more efficient and productive. These reforms had huge and largely unintended consequences. Glasnost, or openness, uncorked decades of pent-up frustration and nationalism. In the various republics that made up the Soviet Union like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Ukraine, people started demanding more autonomy and even independence. The lid was off, and Gorbachev couldn't put it back on. Simultaneously, perestroika didn't fix the economy quickly enough. In fact, in the short term, it made things worse. The transition was chaotic, leading to more instability and shortages. The economic reforms were too little, too late, and they couldn't overcome the fundamental flaws of the communist system. These internal pressures were happening at the same time as Reagan's external pressure. Gorbachev knew the Soviet Union could no longer afford the arms race. He began a series of summit meetings with Reagan to negotiate arms reduction treaties. This was a major thaw in the Cold War. The two leaders, despite representing opposing ideologies, developed a surprisingly good working relationship. They signed treaties like the INF Treaty, which eliminated an entire class of nuclear missiles. The evil empire rhetoric was replaced with dialogue and diplomacy. The real tipping point came in 1989. Inspired by Gorbachev's reforms and seeing that the Soviet Union was no longer willing or able to use military force to crush dissent, popular movements for democracy swept across Eastern Europe. This was the Soviet satellite bloc, the countries that had been under Soviet control since the end of World War II. In Poland, the Solidarity movement won free elections. In Hungary, the government opened its border with Austria, creating a hole in the Iron Curtain. East Germans began flooding through this hole to get to West Germany. The dominoes were falling fast. And then came the most iconic moment of all, the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989. For decades, the wall had been the ultimate symbol of Cold War division. When the East German government, facing massive protests, announced that citizens could travel freely, crowds swarmed the wall. They began to climb it, dance on it, and tear it down with hammers and picks. It was an incredible televised celebration of freedom that symbolized the collapse of communist control in Eastern Europe. Gorbachev made the crucial decision not to send in the tanks, as his predecessors had done in Hungary in 1956 or Czechoslovakia in 1968. He let these countries go their own way. By 1990, Germany was reunified. The Cold War in Europe was effectively over. But the story doesn't end there. The forces of change that Gorbachev had unleashed now turned back on the Soviet Union itself. The nationalist movements in the Soviet republics grew stronger. Hardline communists, horrified by Gorbachev's reforms and the loss of Eastern Europe, attempted to overthrow him in a coup in August 1991. The coup failed, largely thanks to the resistance led by Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic. But it fatally weakened Gorbachev's authority and destroyed what was left of the Central Soviet government. One by one, the Soviet republics declared their independence. Finally, on Christmas Day 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of a country that no longer existed. The Soviet Union was officially dissolved. The Cold War was over. The United States and its democratic capitalist model had won. So, to recap for your AP exam, the end of the Cold War wasn't just about one thing. It was a combination of Reagan's military and diplomatic pressure, the crippling economic weakness and overextension of the Soviet Union, like the war in Afghanistan, and most importantly, the transformative but ultimately uncontrollable reforms of Mikhail Gorbachev, Glasnost, and Perestroika. These forces combined to bring down the Berlin Wall, liberate Eastern Europe, and ultimately dissolve the Soviet Union itself, ending the bipolar world order that had defined the second half of the 20th century. Thanks so much for watching. Please give the video a like, subscribe, and smash that notifications bell for more AP World History Review.